Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I have a special episode joined by a few friends here. I got Patrick, Francesco, and James. So, for folks that don't know each of you guys, they're each kind of leaders in the industry in different regards around application security, vulnerability management, and wear different hats and different capacities. But for folks that don't know you guys, let's do some quick intros first. Like perhaps Patrick, if you want to start.
Yeah, Patrick Garrity. I'm a security researcher at VulnCheck, and spent a lot of time in Vuln data and helping people better understand it and use it.
How about you, Francisco?
Francesco Cipollone of Franco Friend. I'm CEO and co-founder of Phoenix Security. So we spend an enormous amount of time on AppSec data, CloudSec data. Very opinionated about this stuff. Thank you, Chris.
You're definitely excited to have your perspective today. And then last but not least, how about you, James?
Yep, I'm James. I'm been a security engineer for a long time and then started Latio Tech as a way to help security engineers find security tools.
Yeah, definitely. For folks that don't already follow each of these folks, these three gentlemen, please do so. They put out great information around vulnerability management, different application security concepts on James's side. So give them a follow for sure. And for, just to level set a little bit, we're here to have a conversation around the news that kind of broke the industry this week, which was the near collapse of CVE, the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures Program. But, perhaps take us through a timeline, Patrick. What happened? What happened? Then how did we get to this point?
Yeah, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit, right? Because seems like we have a year plus of cascading failures. And so I think, first off, it's like, I think this caught everyone by surprise. But taking a step back, like a little over a year ago, right, NIST NVD stopped processing vulnerabilities for a period of time. And that caught us all by surprise a little earlier in the year last year. But we continue to get information and news from both NIST NVD and CVE.org, which are two different things. And so I think like timeline wise, it's like, well, just in the last week, suddenly like NIST NVD's like, oh, we have this new deferred status. We're not going to work on any old phones anymore. So people are trying to figure out what that implication is. Last week we had VulnCon, and it's the 25th anniversary of the CVE program. And, I think we all, three of us attended it. Like, I don't think there was any concern that what was going to happen this week was going to happen.
No drama was announced.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, like not even a discussion point in anything I've talked about, which is kind of shocking. And then suddenly, MITRE issues a press release on Tuesday, and I have it in front of me. We want to make you aware, of this important potential issue with MITRE. And MITRE manages both their CNA, right? So they're like a CNA of last resort in processing vulnerabilities that don't have a CNA with scope. And then they also operate the program as a whole under the board, right? So there's kind of two scenarios and a lot of speculation when this came out because no one from the CVE program board was commenting or mentioning. And I don't even know if they were, almost seems like maybe they weren't even completely aware that this was going on. Right or wrong, I don't know. I can't speak on behalf of CVE.org. And then just tons of speculation of, okay, if MITRE doesn't get funding as they're mentioning in this note, like if a break in service occurs, we anticipate multiple impacts to CVE, including deterioration of NVD and advisories, tool vendors, incident response operations, and all manner of critical infrastructure. So naturally, I think like issuing this hours before a contract expires is going to instill and create some level of uncertainty and fear in the ecosystem. And then, there was really no mention in the evening, not until the morning, right? When a news person said they renewed the contract for 11 months. And then later in the day, CISA on their homepage, right? So obviously this is getting a lot of visibility and is concerning to a lot of organizations, issued their statement on their homepage, which was, the CVE program is invaluable to the cyber community and a priority of CISO. Last night, CISO executed the option period on the contract to ensure there will be no lapse. There's one other thing I missed. So during all of this, in kind of the middle of the night or early evening, then all of a sudden there was a new the CVEfoundation.org, which was launched by the board members. And so, I think everyone's trying to, in good faith, figure this out because they understand it's important. But to me, there's a lot of mixed signals here of like, was this contract going to be renewed? Like, are we suddenly spinning up a nonprofit to figure out how to sustain this? And so that ultimately leads to a ton of speculation on what the implications are. So hopefully that helps from a timeline perspective, of many of the events that happened over the course of less than 24 hours.
Yeah, as you said, it's not a singular event. There's been a lot of things that have been leading up to this. And, coming out of this, a lot of folks, I think some have made the comment, well, we're good, it's funded now. And I think a lot of people are saying, well, not quite. There's a lot of concern here. Yeah. And I know we're going to dive into that, some of those concerns. And then Frank, I know you have kind of a timeline you were going to show here. If you want to go ahead and throw that up real quick, you should be able to present. If not, let me know.
Yeah, let me see.
Yeah, let me know if I missed anything too.
I think the biggest one was I don't know if you can add the timeline, Chris. Is in the show.
Try to go present in the bottom toolbar there. You should be able to click present. Let me know if that works for you.
Can you see my?
Oh, there we go.
Share
Yep.
screen?
There you go.
Here you go. So I think there are a couple of things that I've seen, and Patrick did a great job on the timeline. Was around October was when we started seeing the spike of a lot of stuff. One thing that while doing the digging into the historical one is that March we start seeing some of the layoffs, some of the impact that we haven't talked about. And that has escalated into the slowdown, into the deferred stuff. And one of the things that I wanted to touch as well is at WonCon, we were discussing about AU vulnerability database and the new distributed system that had kind of appeared overnight. It was a weird coincidence that we have a new idea. And I love the meme that you post out, because there is nothing best in cybersecurity than talking by memes. But I totally agree with you. Like, the solution to all this mess was adding another idea of a carbon copy, kind of the MVD and the CISA CAV. Now, I don't want to shoot down the EU vulnerability database, because I think resiliency in this kind of messy world of CVE is great. But now we have like 15 data points, or I was actually doing some research this morning on each vendor has their own one, plus there are 3 or more category of one. And it makes the case kind of create an industry by confusion.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No. Just to wrap it up, I think everybody kind of took a sigh of relief when CISA kind of put out this statement. But there were a couple of things that were, I think, went down the radar. And I think, James, you did a great job on highlighting how much was the funding between the various things. And nobody saw the drop of actually how much was that shortcoming. And as a consequence of that, CISA had to step in. But CISA is not going to fund the whole CV and MVD in the same capacity, because they're as well struggling with this budget cut overall. So I think this is a lifeline measurement is not the solution. So I'm looking forward to see what the solution is, because I don't think we're out of the woods, and everybody have done a sigh of relief, but we're going to be in a messy situation where they don't have resources. We already see 1 in 5 call to the API failing, and situation is only going to get worse.
Yeah, I think you raised some great points there. It's like, as I said, that it may have been funded or partially funded, but there's still a lot of questions remaining, a lot of problems. James, I'm curious from your perspective. First off, that diagram is great. It'll be making an appearance in my newsletter this week. But from your perspective, you're engaging with a lot of cloud security vendors, application security vendors. Like, what was their reaction to this? The practitioners that you chat with, like, what was the reaction from the folks that you've been interacting with in your network?
Yeah, I think the reason for putting this together, and Francesco can talk really well to this as well, is like a lot of technical folks or people who are more skeptical of CVE sort of look at it and just go, oh, I could make it. It's not that hard. It's just a database. And the problem is there's too many databases, and it misses the point that the real value here is to have a single source of truth, that there's over 450 CNAs, and they're all coordinating to get a single CVE in a single place. And that's the real value of it. And so, me and Frank were in different channels getting spun up, like different vendors all building their own thing. I see stuff from Tom Ulrich, from someone at Adara is working on something. Like there is a whole bunch of stuff happening. But no one is really positioned, I think, to think about what a long-term support plan for this looks like. And unfortunately, it creates such a weird situation where we all agree Microsoft, GitHub, and Google would be the best position to step in here and try to create a new source of truth. But I mean, those are big enterprises, right? They're not going to release we spun up a Google open source CV program. We're going in real time. We're flying here, which is kind of what a lot of the smaller vendors want to do. But then I'm sure Patrick as well can talk about, like, this diagram highlights there's a core place that these institutions solve, but they don't solve everything, right? Like people use Vulncheck, for example, to get additional enrichment because it's needed from different places. And then some vendors maintain their own databases and they update it directly from the CNA sometimes. Sometimes they're publishing things directly themselves. And so the core problem is it's almost, you have to, the main challenge I saw was that in real time, we were trying to create a consensus across it's too hard of a problem to solve, which is why the government like is involved, is you're trying to create consensus across thousands of different vendors and tons of users and institutions to try to figure out what's the new source of truth going to be if it's not MITRE.
Yeah, Patrick, I'm curious. Go ahead and jump in there.
So one thing is, I don't necessarily agree with this graph. And I don't necessarily agree that we should delegate this to a Microsoft or a Google. So I'm going to disagree with you on those things. And the reason why I say is because, like, there are different interests here. The CVE program is an independent body, and that's incredibly important. Big advocate of the CVE program. I think the question is there's been government funding that's maintained this program. There obviously needs to be evolution of this program. I think we shouldn't question we can question things, but like the importance of the program itself, and I think that it's maintained by an independent board, is incredibly important. And there's a lot of players in the ecosystem, right? Like security, most of this starts with security advisories and then downstream, right? The CVE program. And there's a combination of security researchers, bug bounty programs, a ton of different stuff that goes into this CVE program. And so I think the federated model is great. Fundamentally, the breakdown here is that it's the program itself is running on U.S. funding, which obviously is at risk for right or wrong, whatever reasons. The entity maintaining and sustaining the program is a single point of failure.
Yeah,
so I think really, like, that's what the world needs to focus on right now, is like solving for that core problem of MITRE and U.S. funding being the primary single point of failure for this whole program right now.
Yeah, I was going to jump in real quick if I could, Patrick. From my perspective, is like it seems like we're trying to do two different things that are kind of somewhat competing. On one hand, like to James's point, we want a single source of truth, right? We don't want these multiple disparate duplicative databases that we need to wrestle with. But at the same time, we realize that one central point of funding, support, et cetera, creates a single point of failure in the kind of ecosystem here. And in my perspective, not to get political on this, but it does seem like to some extent it's a weird convergence of politics or geopolitics and software and cybersecurity, because now we have a bit of a rift, between the U.S. and EU when it comes to how we address technology and compliance and rights and all these different things. That are kind of conversations going on in the industry, and so now we have the spin up of the, as you said, the EU vulnerability database, and now we have NVD. So it's just this weird bifurcation that's starting to kind of manifest, and all of that, I think in particular makes a problem for practitioners, to James's point, who just want to mitigate organizational risk and like do their job and be defenders, and they're not really interested in the the who's funding it, who's operating it, the geopolitics of it all. I'm curious your guys' perspective on that, because it does seem to be a weird convergence of cybersecurity as a practitioner, but also broader geopolitics and international relations, those kind of things too.
Well, let me jump in there. I think, Chris, you have some great point, and Patrick, I do agree with you. I'm a strong supporter of the CV database and the MVD to be a central measurement of independent body. And I think we discussed that in the EPSS forum in various other SIG, spinning up an MVD, and you being, Patrick, through the weeds of publishing a vulnerability and having vendors shouting at you for publishing it maybe too early or without. It's extremely complicated from a legal perspective, from a political perspective, and it could spin up a whole hurdle. That's why with OWASP, we never took on board the OSVD with Tom Aldrich, even though it's absolutely needed. But the legal ramification of setting up an entity like this are enormous. And the only entities that can actually take this hit, or who is gonna create a lawsuit against the EU or against US federal government, right? So there is that entity and that protection that inherently come from MITRE and CV and running these independently. What I think is necessary is a federated model, or is a distributed model across every nation or every kind of geopolitics, like US, EU. China, Russia have their own one, and Japan as well has their own one. But there need to be one authority, and I think there is no one better than the US leading this charge to issue vulnerability and CVAD. There is a whole debate of, hey, not every vulnerability has a CVAD, because a lot of vendors keep their advisory undercover, and I think that is making, and this will just magnify that effect, I'm afraid, because everybody will say that source is not trusted. I have my additional trusted source of vulnerability, and I have to praise a lot of the work that Wuncheck is doing on transparency around these things. But in general, I think we should continue having this conversation and pushing for CV and MITRE to support maybe a lighter model, because let's not forget, the whole value of the MVD is not just having a database, is all the access required for a modification of a CV, access to those records, the CNA and the CPA accessing and enriching those information. And that complexity is not showing here, as well as all of the enrichment and the gatekeeping of reclassifying risk scoring this database. So there is a lot of work that MITRE and the CV have done in here that is maybe not recognized. And we're the first one who criticize a lot, but because we love our program, we want this to be really good. Like I think we all posted about the backlog and other things, but because we want this to be the best source of truth, and we wanted this to be centralized.
Yeah, James, I'm curious, like, you drew up diagram, and some people are advocating for, Google or the Microsofts of the world to kind of step in. And of course, because they're incredibly well resourced, they have, amazing engineering teams, financial capacity, that kind of thing. But there is some merit to the conversation of saying, well, would they be biased in some of the things that get disclosed or reported, or like, or what vendors do or don't get highlighted? There's, we're a
All of a sudden,
skeptical community here in
the
cyber.
Yeah, the Wiz
Yeah, I
maintained
was gonna say,
database puts every Palo vulnerability like right at the top.
yeah, exactly. Like, we're a skeptical community here, and we know that we can't deny there's incentives at play, and things that like that at play. So I'm curious your perspective. Like, it seems like we do want an independent body, but then there's obviously the complicating factor of, you know, who funds it, who maintains it, you know, who trusts it, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the preference is for an independent body to do it. I think a distributed open source model would be the best thing to do, but because of the thing I don't know how to overcome is the staffing requirements for doing the CNA coordination and handoff and the disclosure timelines and some of the how much vulnerability enrichment to do in the first place. I think ideally it could look like an open source repo that people are just opening pull requests to. But then what happens when you have CNAs that like don't know how that works, and like that's a weird workflow for them and they need something else, and that's where I, there to some extent.
If you're a tech company though, and you can't deal on pull requests, like that's fundamentally a problem.
I disagree. Come on, we have a lot of tech company that were created in the 1980s or in the Middle Ages, where even filling up a form can be complicated. So we want.
But is that okay for us to say? Yeah, it's okay for you to live in the past, right? Like, I think that's a real question, and yeah, I think we have to be realistic. And this was a big thing that Andrew Pollack at the conference last week was emphasizing is like in 25 years, there's been no additional requirements of the CVE program to enter anything other than a description in I think 2 other fields. And so it's like you have to start raising
Patrick,
this bar. Like you have to start, you know, setting expectations that like if people are going to be selling hardware and software, they're actually, you know, gonna ensure they do best practices. We can't make this stuff optional. Like Chris, I know you're a big advocate with this, you know, the Secure by Design pledge, but
yeah, well, I was going to jump in. And I was going to say we're starting to kind of bleed into, you know, and I want to let James finish his train of thought here too. But we're bleeding into like, you know, who defines best practices and what is the bare minimum requirement for security and or compliance. And this is kind of, you know, venturing into regulatory kind of measures rather than, you know, voluntary ones, and that is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah,
that you know we again cannot get consensus on, it seems, in the community. But James, I know you're kind of going down a path there. I want to let you jump back in if you want.
I love that happened because it's also a sign that like there's also not a company that wants to take on this drama of like the discussion of like what field should be required and what should the workflow be, and oh, what about our Perl versus CPE versus we use this other thing.
Let's not get into Perl.
That's what I'm saying. Like nobody there's no incentive for someone to do it, and that's why in this time of calamity, I don't know, it feels like the movie Don't Look Up, where it's like, please, Google and Microsoft, like they have a lot of money, like maybe they'll volunteer to like do this if the government's not. But it gets to like, that's why the Google Microsoft suggestion is just they have a lot of money to maybe do it and to maybe deal with the drama, but it's definitely not ideal. But then we're back to this like Linux Foundation kind of mentality. And then I just worry that when you like MITRE's already a nonprofit, and when we're talking about creating another nonprofit, it feels like a nonprofit for your nonprofit, and then once again we're just trying to get government funding again, and it seems like it's a difficult thing to try to solve unless you take the time to really build. I think there is room for an organic OSVD v2 kind of thing where I think a lot of these companies would financially support like how they do with OWASP, where you just have like a sponsorship thing, which is a little NASCAR-y, right? To have the CVE presented by Palo Alto or whatever. But to have like the different sponsorship tiers, I think that's a realistic way to go to fund something like this. But I would rather see
to have CVEs, Fortinet CVEs sponsored by Fortinet.
Well, I think what I'd like to see is for MITRE to move some of the like get some privatized funding along the way and sort of transition to this model. But I also just don't know how realistic that is. And my concern is that because there's funding now, like now the takeaway is, oh, it's funded. And then we all sort of just move on again. And then it's this endless sort of collapse. Like there needs to be movement towards other sources of funding for this, which I think like there are a ton of vendors who, as soon as this news hit, we're trying to scramble and figure out like, how can we make an open source version of it? Like people care about this now. And I think the security industry and the vulnerability industry specifically is so much bigger than it was even 10 years ago. And then if you push back even further than that, and I think that's why there's people care about this stuff in a way that only the biggest tech companies really cared, I think, about 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think just real quick on that note, the community obviously cares, the vendors obviously care, as we saw from the outcry of frustration and willingness to support it. But I think, in my opinion, the government should also care, because we're realizing software is critical infrastructure, and these systems that underpin the software ecosystem are part of that critical infrastructure. So it's kind of bizarre that it got down to this point of nearly losing funding at the 11th hour. In my opinion, like, this is just a massive underappreciation of how important these kind of programs are.
Yeah, I just don't. It's the new reality is just, I don't, who knows how long this goes on for or whatever. It is sort of surreal to see in the news all these, like, the Doge coming for this or for that, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, whoa, this is this must be what all these other industries are feeling when all of a sudden government thing.
Well, that's what someone made a comment. Maybe this is where you pull a plug and see who yells, and like they pulled the plug almost, and everyone yelled, and it was like, oh, okay, well, this apparently is a real thing that we need.
I think the other thing is, like, yeah, there's a lot of people involved, and I have a lot of empathy for federal workers right now. It's not, not a great position to be in. I'm sure advocating for federal funding like this, it probably happened at the 11th hour for multiple reasons. From a headwinds perspective with funding, those are real realities. So yeah, I do want to just kind of mention, like, people involved. I talked to a lot of these folks, and it's not anyone in these jobs, in these positions in the federal side, or with MITRE, like, they're having to make tough decisions. And so, yeah, I do want to advocate, like, being as supportive as possible to people on the ground too. That's a real reality that we need to be mindful and think about.
Agreed. So, we've kind of run the full kind of gamut of where we were trying to take the conversation in terms of what happened, why it mattered, what the impact could have been, what has started to come out of that. I don't like necessarily doing predictions, but if you guys look here, like, it's been funded, I think, for the next 11 months. But, where do we go from here? From each of you, I'm curious, like, as we kind of wrap things up, what's next? Like, is it just going to be, it's good, we're going to keep funding it, we keep down the path we're on? What happens with the EU VDB, or EU vulnerability database that's spun up by ANISA? We have obviously the nonprofit CVE Foundation. Like, what do you guys think is going to be the future here? If you could take a guess at it at all, maybe start with you, Patrick.
Yeah, I do think the CVE Foundation is, like, it's very gray what it is and what it's going to do, but, like, you have board members from the CVE program involved. And so I think that's naturally, like those are people making decisions on the CVE program. Like, naturally, that's a great place to start. So I'd advocate for that. Like, they have a page, it's very vague. I think there's more information coming soon. There's an email address. If you're interested, maybe email it. I don't know. I think also you can participate actively in the CVE program. They have working groups. You can become a CNA. And so I think a lot of people out there, like, scrambling and talking, like, they don't realize that, they can engage with the CVE program. And a lot of them, these warriors don't even engage with the CVE program as far as, on social media posting about it. So I would just encourage people, like, get involved. If you're not involved, like, going and spinning up a new project might be causing more harm than good. So that's what I would probably, advocate most for here is, like, yeah, if you're curious and interested, like, get involved with the CVE program. There's many different paths and ways to do that. And I do think that getting involved with whatever the CVEfoundation.org is probably a good idea if you have interest. This includes downstream consumers, like tool providers, almost every security product. Like, get involved in the CVE program. Like, yes, we should have a stake in interest. Yeah. So, I just want to advocate for that. I think that's incredibly important.
How about you, Frank?
I think we should have had a freeze. Like, I'm with James on this. Like, the world has realized how critical this one is, not by scary factor, but by the fact that it could have stopped. So all of a sudden, the penny did drop yesterday, and I think I've seen more action yesterday than in the past 3 years when we were debating and discussing this. There've been a flurry of conversation, and I put the spotlight. But I think CISA should have held back on that 11 months, because now everybody is more relaxed. Say, oh, the problem is gone. Drama clock is set to 0. And I don't think it is, because they are massively underfunded. The number of backlog is only going to increase. And I think that's where we should aim to hammer. So I fully support the idea from Patrick, and I think we should advocate more. Very few have put a pull request on the CVE database. Those things can act even if you're not a CNA, you're a CPA, or you're a enrichment authority. They'll take those things seriously, and that can help the organization. I think if I can advocate for one thing, is let's stop creating sub databases, because that hurts. And we see with Phoenix, we have 50 mappings, source of truth, for the single source of truth between the various databases, the CV, the PER, the GitHub ID, the CV ID, and now the EUDB. We don't need more IDs. We need one IDs, and everybody to map it back to that one ID. You can have that. So maybe one project we're thinking to spin up with Phoenix is a mapping database that maps all of these sub classification of ID into one single ID. And I promise
Phoenix
we're not going
ID.
to call it Phoenix ID. We have the Phoenix ID, unfortunately, because one of the things we forget is the misconfiguration, license, all of these other things do not have an ID. So we have
looks like
different mapping.
You froze a little bit there on us, Frank. But I think that, it raises a good point of disparate databases, disparate sources of truth, and you need to kind of crosswalk those. It feels like we have a lot of problems in cyber, like framework sprawl, for example. You have to crosswalk your frameworks. Now you have vulnerability identifier sprawl, and you have to crosswalk those among your data sources. So a lot of problems. James, over to you.
I mean, I have to separate into what I would like to see, which is very idealistic, and then what I think will happen. Like, I would love to see, I think the CV Foundation is the best position to do it, but like someone needs to take ownership and get consensus across all of the CNAs and do a CVE 2.0. Like, there needs to be a new data model with a modern hosting infrastructure, with a clear GitHub submission process that's managed by a nonprofit board and is more like Linux Foundation-y. I would love to see all of that. That's well sponsored by all the different vendors. Like, that's what needs to happen, that I would love to see. But realistically, like, we've been sharing that picture of, like, the little open source single maintainer that holds up the whole stack. We've seen that for years, and we will probably continue to see in 11 months we're going to renew or not. Oh, scramble. And then, pray that it happens again. And like, that's the most realistic outcome, unfortunately. But I don't want that to discourage anyone. Someone does need the hard part is we're all looking for someone to get the consensus going. Because that's the only thing that can drive the change here. It can't be like an independent vendor or something. And so I think hopefully CV Foundation's an answer to that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I just was going to give my thoughts, as you guys each have mentioned the CVE Foundation. Like, to your point, James, about industry trying to step in and help. Patrick called for people to get involved. I could see a path here where we hear a lot about public-private partnerships. This is an opportunity for, FFRDCs like MITRE, commercial vendors that we've named, Microsoft, GitHub, Google, etc., many others, to get involved from a financial perspective, from an expertise perspective. It's going to take a coalition, and I think getting the consensus, to your point, James, is going to be the difficult part, because who's going to lead it? Who's going to make the final decisions? Who's going to be the final arbiter of things? So I appreciate you guys jumping on. I appreciate everyone who listened into this. Definitely not a dull week in cybersecurity, to say the least, and that'll take us out for today. So thanks to everyone who listened in, and thanks you gentlemen for joining me.
Thanks
so much.
Thank you, everyone. Hopefully, quiet Easter and no critical vulnerability. I think we had
no XC this year.
Don't jinx us. Don't jinx us.
this year.